Hello class and welcome to the demonstration video for drawing a human skull. And for this video I'll be working on newsprint. You can see the newsprint in front of you. Right now I'm beginning with the charcoal stick and I'm gesturing in a circle just to kind of encapsulate where I think the cranium is for the head. And then I gesture in some angles to insinuate the jaw line coming down to the chin and going up the uh, other side of the jaw over there. Right now, I'm gesturing in the top of the brow line, the brow ridge for the skull. And right there is a little center line. That center line helps me figure out where I'm going to put certain other features later on. And that line at the top of the skull that I just drew in there is where I think a person's hairline would be if there was hair on the skull. And what I'm doing right now is I'm using these major thirds of the skull to plot um, placements of the nasal cavity right now. And so you can tell that I'm gesturing in this sort of triangular shape for the nasal cavity shape. And now I'm just drew in the ridge, the top of the nasal bone there. And now I'm trying to find the shape of this ocular socket over here. Since this is a 3/4 view, 3/4 angle of the skull, that eye socket that I just drew in over there is going to be narrower than the other eye socket that I draw in later on. And I'm just continuing to find the shapes of these contours on this right edge of the skull here. Right there was the bottom of the zygomatic bone, and I'm just reshaping that outer edge of that ocular socket. Now I'm working on the zygomatic bone, the outer edge of the zygomatic bone there. Just above the ocular socket here is where I'm working on these contours. And as you'll see throughout the video, I go back and I correct contours constantly as I'm working throughout this demo video, because you start off with a rough generalized idea of these shapes. Like I said earlier with that sphere that I drew in, that was just kind of to encapsulate where I think the cranium is. And now I'm going back into these outer edges of the cranium, making more of a descriptive direction and angle for those contours there. Now I'm trying to plot that other ocular socket, the skull's right ocular socket. Obviously, the ocular sockets are what holds our eyes in place and protects our eyes from it, anything. And so, again, I'm doing really quick gestural angles of these forms. There's more curvatures and more undulations to those contours that I'm drawing right now, and I go back over later on to shore those contours up and make them a little more descriptive and more exact to all the different, contour directions that I see in the photo of the skull. And this drawing, again, is done from a photograph. You can actually see the photograph in the upper left over there. And as I was explaining that you could see that image over there to the left, I decided to put the digital file for the image that I was working from in the upper right hand corner of this video. So go ahead and pay attention to that as I'm working on this drawing, so you can get a good idea of what I was working on at that exact moment. And so as you've seen at this point, I've already gone back several times to take those gestural contours that I began with at the beginning of this video, those really simplified shapes and really straight edges to contours, and I've gone back into them several times to give them a more descriptive shape according to what I was seeing in the photo. And just trying to erase back some of those really lightly applied gestural lines from earlier. Now I'm working on the outside edge of the zygomatic bone right here. This is a very crucial area of the skull to get right. whenever you're drawing people that actually have flesh and muscles over their skull, you can actually see that bony spot of the zygomatic bone up there um, pretty easily. It shows off light and shadow really, really well, and it's a very descriptive point of a portrait that you really need to get in order to create a likeness of the subject that you're looking at. Also, we're working from photographs for this project. I will put the photographs, sorry, this is just a homework, not a project, but I will put these photographs into Canvas in the module for this week. And so what I'm going to start drawing right now is this line right here designates the spot where the upper row of teeth overlap over the bottom row of teeth. And as you can tell, I'm trying to encapsulate that sort of smile-esque shape that happens with the human teeth there. And what I'm using right here is a projection line on down to figure out where I want this outer edge of the maxilla to be and where I want the furthest left tooth to be in the drawing. And so that gives you a good understanding of how my mind works with how I project all of these shapes off of each other, right? And so when I start working teeth in, I don't draw specific shapes of teeth right off the bat. Really, I find certain values and shapes of values to mark in, like some of the darkest darks. I'll find the placement for those and get those in real quick, but I don't usually worry about drawing a super specific shape of a tooth just yet. I will try to, encapsulate the overall light source that's happening over the teeth, because the most important thing is that we figure out how to properly communicate the way light and shadow displays the form of the skull, okay? Because we want the skull to feel sculptural, to feel like we can stick our hands into the drawing and pull the skull out. So in order to do that, we really need to figure out how light and shadow affect the skull and show the skull to us. And so right now I'm sort of gesturing in where I think some of these teeth insert into the mandible down here. And I'm pretty sure I end up correcting all this later on, because the skull is one of the more complicated things that you can draw from life and from observation. And so you're going to end up correcting a lot of stuff. Like I've said in so many demo videos, a major component to drawing is editing. Right now I'm editing what I just drew down there, right? So nobody's right on the first try ever. And so I'm trying to be loose and quick. Again, just like all my other videos, this video is sped up to 2x speed. Overall, this drawing took me at least 2.5 hours to make, and there's still stuff that even with the finished image that you have at the end of this video to look at, there's stuff that you can constantly tweak and make more accurate or better here and there. As you can tell right now, I need to extend this jaw down, right? So really paying attention to the overall height, to the overall width of the skull is extremely important. I made it a little squatty and kind of short compared to what it should have been from the beginning, but I eventually recognized that and I move the jaw down. And what that does is it changes, that height to width ratio and gives this person a little bit more of a balanced face, I think. And it brings down that left edge of the jaw structure. At first, that was way too short. And so I ended up pulling it down, making it more accurate, right? So we're going for accuracy in terms of all this stuff, in terms of light and shadow relationships, facial proportions. Right now, you can tell I'm working in the very bottom edge of the zygomatic bone. And if you look at its relationship to the other spot, that same exact spot of the zygomatic bone on the other side, from this angle, you're going to want those, one side of the face to be a little bit lower or higher than the other. And actually, I think I drew that part of the zygomatic bone a little bit low for my drawing, and so it actually should be a little bit higher, because if you look at the reference photo up in the upper right hand corner, the bottoms of the zygomatic bones, those points underneath the eye sockets, the one on the left side is a little bit higher than the one on the right, and that's because of linear perspective, because the skull is turned in a 3/4 view. As you can tell, the same thing happens with my ocular sockets in the drawing. The ocular socket to our left is a little bit higher up compared to the ocular socket to the right, and that's because of perspective. And the same thing should have happened with my zygomatic bones, but I kind of messed that up in my drawing. But, you know, the drawing I ended up coming up with, I think, is pretty interesting to look at least. And so I just keep correcting all of these forms more and more. I decided to, when I'm actually for the first time drawing in that section of the maxilla back there. And so just taking out some of these loose gestural lines, it's great to have, all these loose gesture lines at first to map out where you want, your features to be and all that. But, if you leave them in, they might confuse you later on in the drawing whenever you want to add stuff like, the light and shadow relationships, or more detailed elements like the different textural elements in the skull, or different, marks that need to be descriptive. And so, step back a lot when you make these drawings. You're going to end up making 3 different skull drawings. I'm just showing you the 3/4 view right now, and what I'm doing now is figuring out where I want these shadow families to be. So as you can tell, I'm kind of finding the edge of this really dark shadow shape that shows that the light is coming in from the right of the photo that I'm working from, and everything on the left is of the skull is going to be in shadow. And so I'm just moving down the skull here, finding the edge to these major shadow forms. And these are all called form shadows. These are not cast shadows. These are form shadows, meaning that they're shadows that are connected to the form and display the form of the object that we're looking at. So I'm going to keep continuing moving down. This is pretty much the side plane of the face, okay? Everything with the features on it, like the eyes and the nose and the mouth, that's all on the frontal plane of the face. Right now, I'm finding the edges to the shadows of the side planes of the face. I wouldn't really consider this part of the maxilla a side plane, but there's a really strong dark shadow edge there that I needed to find. So right now, as you can tell, the skull's looking really flat, but later on, towards the end of the drawing, it really starts to have a lot of form to it, because I start to work in not just the darkest darks, but also, the mid tones as well. So for your drawings, I want you all to try to illustrate the full range of value that you're looking at with your skull. Find the lightest lights, find the darkest darks, and find all the medium tones in between, and illustrate all of them as best you can. For these bigger ones, you're going to end up making two skull drawings on newsprint, and then one skull drawing in your sketchbook. And for these ones in your newsprint sheets, try to make them at the very least the size of your head. This drawing of mine ends up being a little bit bigger than my actual head, and that's also fine if you want to try that out and really push for a large drawing of a skull. That'd be great. Obviously, the drawing in your sketchbook is going to be much smaller than your head, and so for these bigger ones, you should spend at least 2 to 2.5 hours on them, and really work quickly and correct as often as you need to correct, and really analyze, how all of those relationships of the light and shadow, form, and mark making are coming together in your drawing. As you can tell, I'm still at this point finding all these different shadow shapes to work from. Um, and you can use a similar process to this if you were to draw, one of these skull models in person from life, not from a photograph. You can still use this same process of like blocking in and finding the shapes of the uh, shadow families and all those dynamic shapes. Um, Usually, whenever I'm working from life, when I'm observing a model in person, not from a photograph, I will do a similar thing in blocking in all of these shapes, but I do them a lot faster, and I usually block them in with like major value blocks and shapes instead of just drawing the outlines of all of the shadows. But since I was working from photo, I felt like I could be a little slower and a little more analytical this way with it. The other way I just described is a little more gestural and free and quick. And usually, if you're studying a person from reality, from life, they're always going to move a little bit. And so you need to draw a little quicker, a little more free, and then correct later on. Um, and so, as you can tell, I'm still figuring out all these really specific shapes to all of the edges of the skull. I was just working on the cranium again a second ago. Now I'm trying to figure out where some of these shadow shapes are going to be. And I just keep finding all of these different contours and outlines to these shadow shapes, really trying to nail them down and figure out what their location should be and what, the shape of their outlines should be. Because all of that really helps to describe the form and the volume of this object that we're looking at the skull. And a lot of those different angles and shapes to those shadow families will tell you in terms of what is going on with the skull in terms of planar directions. And now I'm starting to block in these shadow planes right here. And I'm doing that with the side of my charcoal stick. I turned my charcoal stick on the side, and it's fine to, block all these tones in over top of these lines you've already made. It's not a big deal because you can still, for the most part, see through the charcoal and see what those specific marks are. And I go back over them to make some of them darker and remind myself where they are. And I also still continue to block in these shadow family values as well. Now I'm using my uh, charcoal stick still, but in a lighter fashion with less pressure on it to make these shadow families a little bit lighter than the darker ones that I had just made a second ago. And that's because I'm just trying to figure out, I'm trying to exactly replicate the value structures that I'm seeing in my photograph of the skull there. And I find some darker core shadows there that I need to work back into with a darker, heavier hand with the charcoal stick there. As you can tell, I'm constantly reworking these contours of not only the skull edges, but also the shadow family shapes. Their outlines need to be found again after I block in those tones with the charcoal stick. Some of those contours and outlines get lost, so I need to go back in with my eraser and fix those up. Because again, with this drawing, we're trying to be as descriptive as possible and as representational as possible of the skull we're looking at. Now I'm darkening in with, again, heavier pressure with the tip of the vine charcoal there to give a darker shadow to imply, the true roundedness of the cranium here. And there's a bunch of like little bumps in the cranium, so some parts of the bone are going to be a little more in shadow than others. And so you need to find all those darkest darks that you can where they are. And I'm just going to keep finding the darkest values where I think they should be. Right now I'm still using the charcoal stick. Later on I will get into using charcoal pencils. And so some of those marks will end up getting very, very dark. Again, just trying to find where some of these shadow families relate to the teeth. Like I said, I haven't drawn specific teeth shapes to this point, and I'm still just trying to figure out how the values work on the teeth and around the teeth, and figuring out, where certain descriptive marks need to go later. And right now, I'm really lightly blocking in these shadow tones up here because in the photo there's a really soft blue shadow there, and so I needed to replicate that in the drawing. Still finding all of these more subtle shadow families on this other side of the cranium here. Going back and constantly reworking my contour lines. As you can see, I'm doing that with this section of the cranium here. So yeah, this really shows how much correcting I do. I spent, several minutes just trying to get that contour into the right shape to be as descriptive as possible. One thing that's important when drawing a skull is making sure you understand and illustrate how the light spills into the ocular socket. I start off by drawing my darkest darks really within this ocular socket, and then I'll, block in more of a mid-tone shadow that encapsulates the whole area of the inside of the ocular socket, and then I constantly build up the darks a little bit more here and there because, like, there's some holes in some of the bony structures in there, I guess, for blood vessels and stuff to go in and out of. And finding those is very important, again, because that is a descriptive component to the subject, in this case, the skull. Really softly using my fine charcoal here to get some of the shadow shapes just above the brow line there. And what you'll probably notice throughout this video is on the light family side of the skull, so in this case, the light is hitting the skull on the right side of it, and so all of those values over there they're kind of difficult to see, and I end up being very minimalistic in terms of mark making when I describe some of those shadow shapes later on. And so I'm finding some of these darkest darks within this hole, this space behind the maxilla and the bottom of the bottom of the maxilla and the mandible back here. See how we can see through that little hole? Trying to properly display the effect of light and shadow in that space back there. Again, when you're working from your photographs of these skulls, feel free to print them out and hang them on your wall. That's what I did for this demo. I had the photo of the skull hanging on the door just to the left of my drawing board in my drawing. And it's very helpful to print it out and have it on the wall because I'm not the type of person that likes to keep looking down at my computer over and over again when I'm drawing. So it's good advice, I think, for you all to put it on the wall after you've printed it out. And so I'm going back in and reinvestigating some of those shadow tones up there just above the ocular socket and blocking in some darker tones right here in that area of the ocular socket there. Really lightly blocking in some of those shadow shapes on the cranium. Now I'm working back into just inside the ocular socket just to kind of play up some of these dark values within there. I don't smudge too much with my finger whenever I draw in general, but sometimes it's easier to erase a really small amount of charcoal with your finger compared to when you're using an eraser. Sometimes an eraser will take off more charcoal than I want. And so I'm going back in right now, reevaluating all of these different uh, value relationships of my lights and my darks just under the ocular socket here. And I found that there are some highlights on the edges of the ocular socket, especially in this section that you see me working on right now. I'm erasing out some of those highlights, but then I just went back in and blocked in a slightly darker shadow in one spot. This right here is one of these little holes just above the ocular socket in the brow ridge area. And I'm assuming that's for blood vessels to go inside of the skull. The fun thing about these skulls that you'll be using to draw from for this homework assignment is that they were cast or molds of actual skulls that were donated to science. So this skull, you know, it belonged to a person at one point in time. Again, this is just a plastic skull in the image that I'm working from, but yep, came from a person. And so very medically accurate skull to be working on for this drawing. And like I said, the other two skulls will also, it's going to be the same skull just from different angles. So like I said, for this homework drawing, you'll make three different drawings, two on newsprint, one in your sketchbook, and it'll be of three different angles of this same skull that we're seeing in this video. Now I'm finding some of the dark moments inside of the nasal cavity that these dark shadows that I'm blocking in right now silhouette one of the bones inside of the nasal cavity. I'm assuming it's some type of sinus bone that holds your sinuses in place. And, that's the only reason we can see that sinus bone in there is because there's a dark shadow behind it that silhouettes it and allows us to see that shape nicely. I'm trying to find some of these shadow tones down here. Cleaning up the contours. As you can tell, I ended up creating a lot of smudges to the right of the skull because that's where I rested my hand, or I would put a finger down on the page so it would kind of steady my hand that I'm drawing with. And I would constantly erase those out throughout this demo video, and that's something that it's a lot easier to erase out those smudges right when they happen. Or I've noticed in the past that I'll just smear like oil from my hand onto the smudge mark, and I won't be able to erase it out later on. So cleaning those up immediately when they happen is really important. I'm trying to find some of these dark shadow tones inside of the nasal cavity that help us see the edge of the nasal cavity there. Constantly going back in and changing shapes that need to be changed. Finding this darkest shadow here. It's a really descriptive shadow because it's a form shadow for that part of the nasal bone that comes out. And at this point, I needed to switch batteries in my camera, and so I'm gonna draw kind of with this light set up for a few minutes because I forgot to turn on my two cool studio flood lights. So the lighting's gonna be like this for a couple minutes, but I'll eventually fix it. Now I'm going back in with my 6B charcoal pencil to find some of these darkest darks inside of the ocular socket there. And now I'm finding this darkest dark on the edge of my zygomatic bone up there. And I'm, blocking these values in and creating this shadow edge with my 6B pencil. And so in some areas for your skull, the 6B charcoal pencil is going to be pretty dark. So you need to pay attention to how heavy your pressure on the charcoal pencil is whenever you're working with it, because if it's the 6B pencil and you need to use it because a shadow tone or something is considerably darker than the 2B pencil can get, but not quite as dark as what the 6B is usually used for, then you need to just be really soft with when you apply the 6B, and it'll end up working out. Right now, I'm trying to find this edge to the zygomatic arch that goes down the side plane of our face there. And this part of the bone, what it's doing is going straight back to where the middle of the ear is, essentially. Um, and later on, I end up moving this contour that I just drew in down more, actually, because I drew it too high at this point in the video. But yeah, always analyzing, stepping back and looking at what you're working on from, you know 10, 15 feet away is always a good idea, because that helps you see the proportional relationships throughout the subject that you're drawing a lot easier than if you're just, you know, a foot or two away from it all the time. So yeah, right now I'm about to move that contour down because I just stepped back and realized that I drew it too high up. As you can tell, I'm using my pinky to kind of stabilize my hand a little bit as I'm drawing this mark in. And this is a good thing about the charcoal pencils. You can create as long of a tip with it as you want if you use like an X-Acto knife to sharpen your pencil. If any of y'all haven't looked up like a YouTube video on how to sharpen your pencils with an X-Acto knife, go ahead and do that. There's some pretty helpful videos on YouTube that you can find to do so. But also, using pencil sharpeners works pretty great for charcoal pencils as well. Now I'm trying to find some of these highlighted edges to the top of that zygomatic arch back there. Even though that zygomatic arch is on the shadow side of the skull, there's still some lighter tones that you need to explore, and you can see that in the photo pretty easily. Going back into the nasal cavity with my 6B pencil to try to find some of these darkest darks in there and really show that there's a lot of shadow inside of the nasal cavity there. Anytime you have a cavity, in the skull, there's going to be a lot of shadow in there, and there's always a little bit of light that spills into. Speaking of light, I decided to turn my soft white lights back on. Continuing to go back into the ocular socket, finding these darkest darks again to really show that progression of light into the ocular socket. Because what that does is, as you can probably tell, there's a lot more depth inside of those ocular sockets now compared to earlier. Now I'm trying to make this contour a little bit more descriptive. The contour of that ocular socket and how the contour of the nasal bone comes in front of the ocular socket. That's one thing you need to pay attention to in this 3/4 view, is that nasal bone is going to block that ocular socket on the far side of your vantage point, the other side of the skull. Um, yeah, the ocular socket's always blocked just a little bit by the tip of the nasal bone. So pay attention to that. And now I'm going back into my teeth to kind of block in some of the darkest shadow spots within there. And, those shadow moments really help show some of the contours of these teeth. Like I said earlier, I didn't draw a specific contour line all the way around each tooth individually because that's not really what I see. I see shapes of value with some descriptive contour elements here and there to show off the shape of the teeth. And I know this is kind of a more long-winded video. Um, I tried to find ways to kind of edit this down and make it a little faster of a video, but there's just so much detail involved with this process of drawing a skull. So I really think that I needed to just stick with the longer video. As you can tell, I'm still trying to find all of these different value shifts in just above these teeth, where these teeth insert into the maxilla. There's all of these subtle changes in value and in tone. So really think about, always, in your mind, remember what those value scales look like when you think about the value relationships you're looking at. Because you need to have a reference for, oh, if this value I put down here looks this way, then this other value is going to end up looking that way down the road. And that's, why I had y'all draw those value scales earlier in the semester. Um, you know, because I think for the most part, everybody sees value for the most part the same way. But having that reference of a value scale in mind helps you just understand how all the values might look relatively compared to each other throughout your process of creating the skull drawing and creating any drawing in general. Because you really need to find your darkest darks, your lightest lights, and your midtones and everything in between, your quarter tone lights and your quarter tone darks. All of that stuff needs to come together in order for the drawing to look believable, whether you're drawing a skull or a landscape or anything, because all of those value shifts tell us what the form of all the objects we're drawing truly is. And so I'm trying to find some of these darkest darks, that silhouette, that edge of the zygomatic bone here, and the edge of the upper maxilla as well. Just trying to create that sense that there's a recession inward through this space because there's some shadow in there and the light doesn't fully get into there, right? So I need to display that. And it really helps to give some depth to this area inside of the skull that wasn't there earlier. Trying to find these little holes again. I think they're a pretty descriptive moment in the skull itself. And right now I think I'm using my 2B probably there. So I use my 2B, 4B, and 6B pencils throughout this drawing. I didn't have a 4B in your materials packet, so you can just use your 2B and 6B and you'll be able to find most of or all the values that you really need. Using those in conjunction with your Vine charcoal sticks, and you'll be able to get everything. Also, whenever I've been using these charcoal pencils, I'm not doing a super rigid and super analytical crosshatch. I've been doing kind of a scribble hatch. I talked about that earlier on the semester, with the value scales. You can have a very structured and almost rigid cross hatching and hatching mark making element, or you can have one that's kind of a scribble hatch that's really quickly put in. Um, and that's kind of what I've used mostly throughout this video with the charcoal pencils, is more of like a scribble hatch idea, just really quickly laying the tones in and getting my pesky eraser marks out of the way. Trying to think of presentation as much as possible when making this drawing. And at some point, this might be the point where I do it, but I go back into a bunch of these contours to lighten them up a little bit, because as you notice at first, that contour to this edge of the cylinder of the mouth here that I've been working in um, was really dark and really flat. And what that'll do is flatten out your form. So now you can tell that all of those contours around the mouth, and now these contours to the bottom edge of the zygomatic bone here that I'm drawing in, I lightened those up and then went back over them with um, a charcoal pencil that has a thinner line than the charcoal stick, and it allowed me to add some variety and some nuance to those edges. And depending on how you manipulate that, you can help provide a little bit more of a form and curvature to those contours, allowing those contours to kind of recede away from the viewer, because that's what's, even though I'm working from a flat photo, a two-dimensional photo of a three-dimensional skull, I know that that part of the skull is further away from me in space. So I'm going to lighten up those contours a little bit more. And now I'm going back in, uh, trying to be a little bit more descriptive with my contours here of these edges of the ocular socket up there. Like I said earlier, you start off with a more general, abstract gesture line that, roughly encapsulates and describes what's going on with those contours of the shapes that you draw, and then you go back later on to make them more descriptive, uh, typically with a charcoal pencil. Right now, I noticed that there were some darker shadow tones towards these edges of this contour of the jaw down here, and what that means is there's a little bit of a curvature that happens towards that edge of the mandible down there. So I needed to describe that. And now I'm trying to block in some more of these mid-tone value shapes on the ridge of the nasal bone up there. And I go back in with a slightly darker mark within those mid-tone values to try to find some of those textural elements of like the little subtle cracks and recessions inside of the nasal bone up there. And what that helps me do with my drawing is provide a little bit more of a textural component to the drawing. When we make art, we always think about texture, okay? So we need to communicate and simulate texture to a degree, especially when we're drawing something like a skull, because I think that when it looks like a bone and has the texture of a bone, it just feels more real to the viewer. And when you're drawing something like a skull that's so psychologically impactful, we really want to have that sense that the skull feels like bone, because it reminds us of our own mortality, I think. And so that's why the skull is such a powerful symbol. It's not just a skull, it's symbolic of so much more. Trying to find some of these slightly darker tones on my zygomatic arch here, because I didn't draw those tones dark enough with the charcoal pencil, because I knew later on I was going to come back in and block in the darkest darks in these areas of my form shadow here. And what that does is it just does a better job of communicating the light and shadow relationships and really telling us where where that zygomatic bone sits in space related to all of the other areas of shadow on this side plane of the head of the skull. Right now I'm using my kneaded eraser and forming it into a sharp point so I can find some of those really, really small highlights there on that section of the zygomatic bone down there. Trying to find some of these darkest darks again. Um, that's just kind of how I draw. Sometimes I'll, be working in a space and then I'll think of, oh, there's a highlight over here. I need to move over to where that highlight is and put that highlight in before I forget about it. Maybe some of y'all work differently where you find, a full shadow shape that you want to express and you'll work that entire shadow shape in and then you'll notice something later on. I'm a little sporadic with the way I draw, kind of move around from spot to spot a lot. Some people just work differently and have like one idea that they stick to and feel that idea out fully and then go to another spot. But as you can tell, I kind of like bounce around the skull over and over and over and over and over again, trying to find some of these slightly darker moments. I'm taking my 2B pencil right now, my 2B charcoal pencil, and I'm going back over some of those earlier vine charcoal stick um, tones to make them just a little darker. Because, if you look at the photo, those shadows just weren't dark enough just yet. Using my 2B pencil to very, very, very lightly, I'm barely putting any pressure on the pencil when I'm making these lines because I know that there's some shadow in there because the zygomatic bone recesses inward away from you, away from the light. So I know there's going to be some shadow in that area, but you don't really see it in the photo all that well, but it's there. And so I'm trying to basically create more realistic transitions of value inside of the nasal bone a second there. Now I'm trying to find some of these shadow shapes that lead on down from the bottom of the nasal cavity into the tops of the teeth. And it really helps to describe what's going on there in terms of the planar effects of those bones leading into the tops of the teeth there. Using my 2B pencil for all of these. Anytime you see a relatively light shadow tone being applied with my charcoal pencil, I'm using a 2B pencil for that. Again, using my 2B pencil to find these quarter tone uh, light, well, I guess more of a mid tone shadow is what we're expressing there. I'm noticing that more darks needed to be applied into this area of the jaw. Constantly reworking these values over and over and over again. I mean, there's definitely a point, as much as I enjoy drawing skulls and bones, that's just something I've always kind of enjoyed my whole life. But even though I enjoy it a lot, it definitely feels a little tedious sometimes. And it's like, man, how much more do I have to go? And sometimes you just have to push through that and really work towards fully displaying the light and shadow effects of your skull to create something that really represents what you're looking at, and it's just inescapable. Sometimes you just really have to tap into that mentality of really grinding through it. So I'm trying to express some of those cast shadows just behind the this area of the upper mandible there, to really show that there's light still going in, even though that's the shadow side of the skull. There's some ambient light from the background spilling into those shadows, and there's a little bit of a cast shadow there. So I needed to express that. Now I'm trying to find some of these more highlighted points of the mandible there. Now I'm going to come back in with my 2B pencil and really lightly uh, hatch in some shadows there, because that area of the maxilla, even though it catches a little bit of light compared to the darker moments of the maxilla, it's not quite as highlighted as that other plane that I just erased into there. So again, trying to find the edges of that maxilla, making sure, of that mandible, and making sure that they're just right in terms of shape, so it feels descriptive to the photo that I'm looking at. Coming back in with my eraser to bring out a little bit of a highlight there, just a little more. And I just continue shoring up and fixing up my value relationships here and there to push this drawing more towards a finished state. Trying to make some of these darker tones speak a little bit more in the upper zygomatic bone up there. Now I'm working back in with my 6B, kind of light with my pressure of the 6B, but I noticed that some of these darker tones needed to be darker than they actually were. So working back in. One thing that helps me see value is stepping back from the drawing and blurring my vision or squinting my vision. And what that does is it kind of blurs what you're looking at and takes a lot of the detail out of your drawing. When you have your eyes squinted, you can't see the detail as much, and what you can see is the more vague transitions of light and value across the surface of what you're looking at. And it actually helps a lot with seeing the major value relationships instead of the detailed value relationships. So stepping back and analyzing not only the proportions of your skull but also the value structures by squinting helps a lot with that. So go ahead and try that out a lot whenever you work with this skull. I'm sure a lot of y'all figured that out, and I'm pretty sure I mentioned that earlier on in the semester, but if you forget to do that, you should really do that. It helps you see the value relationships much easier. And so I'm just trying to be more descriptive with some of these smaller bony shapes just underneath the zygomatic arch back here. Really getting in those shadows as well. That a lot of those shadows show off the descriptive contour and outline of those bony elements in there. So it's really important to find your darkest darks and make sure they're the right shape to show off the edges of the bones that aren't so in shadow. And now I noticed that there was a form shadow missing on this very back edge of the zygomatic bone there. So I decided to block some of these values in with my 2B charcoal pencil. As you can tell, the 2B charcoal pencil is a little bit darker than the vine charcoal marks that are already there. I needed to have a little bit more light on this section of the mandible, so I'm going back in with my kneaded eraser to erase those out. Just trying to find some of these darkest dark moments in this area of the mandible down here. trying to express that hole that's in the just under the ocular socket there. There's a hole in the skull that was missing in my drawing. Wanted to find that, express that to make it a little more descriptive, and I'm trying to block in some of these shadow shapes in this area that leads down into the maxilla because some of these shadow shapes were missing, needed to be added into this area for it to be a more descriptive drawing. And it kind of helps to express some of the textural qualities of the bone as well. Continue to block in some of these darkest darks in there to help there become more of a shadowed effect back into that area of the maxilla. Really light. Oh, I'm trying to find this hole just under the ocular socket on that opposite side, because there's a hole on the other side as well, and so I needed to find both of those. Trying to find some of these shadow elements under these curved parts of that zygomatic bone down there. Trying to create a more descriptive contour here to that outer edge of the zygomatic bone. I noticed that the shape of this zygomatic bone here that makes the ocular socket is a little incorrect, so I needed to fix that shape. As I said earlier in the demo, always fixing contours whenever I notice they need to be changed. Changing the contour to the ocular socket up there as well to make it more accurate and more descriptive to the photo that I'm looking at. Just constantly making these changes, adding some more slightly darker shadowed effect into the ocular socket as well. Really trying to match the value relationships in my drawing to what I see in the photo as best as I can. And like I said, at this point in the drawing process, I've been working for almost 2.5 hours about. And a lot of that time some of that time was spent stepping back from the drawing and analyzing. And I noticed that these shadow forms underneath the very bottoms of these teeth down here need to be a little bit darker. Wasn't quite lining up in my drawing the way it should have been. Some darker tones up here in the cranium needed to be added as well. And I'm about done with the video because I'm about to the point where I made it with the drawing. So here's the final image of my drawing. I would say that this is pretty much 90 to 95% finished. In reality, I could keep analyzing the lights and darks a little bit more. For example, I think that this drawing could actually use some more detail in the lower row of teeth. But it's pretty darn close to finish. And so, like I said, I ended up spending about 2.5 hours on this drawing, and it is a large drawing. This drawing of the skull is bigger than my actual head. And so it does take some time, right? And so what I want you all to do is really push for the light and shadow effects that you see in the photo and replicate them with your skull drawing. Like I said, for this homework, you're going to do 3 different skull drawings. You're going to do one on newsprint. You're going to do another one on newsprint. Try to make those about the same size as your head in terms of scale. And then you're going to make one skull drawing in your sketchbook, which is obviously going to be a lot smaller than the other 2 drawings. And you're going to do 3 different viewpoints of the skull, and I'm going to provide you the images to work from. And so for these drawings, use your Vine charcoal stick, use your charcoal pencils, and just kind of the process that I show you in this video and you'll do great. All right, thank you very much.